Is Pinterest a buy going into earnings? A lot of people are thinking about buying into social networks for earnings now because Snapchat had really great earnings and shot up quite nicely. In fact, if you looked at the other social media stocks like Pinterest, Facebook, and Twitter, and you didn't know anything and you just saw what happened to them today, you would have thought that they reported earnings because every social media stock did very well following on Snapchat's success. The reason is that Snapchat had great revenue, and since these social networks have very similar revenue models, just in the basic sense of advertising, some of them have their nuances, but a lot of it is based on advertising. So Snapchat did very well, and you assume that a lot of that rubbed off on the other social networks. So that brings us to Pinterest, which reports earnings on October 28th and is expected to do 3 cents per share as its EPS. Now, Pinterest has beat EPS in 3 of the past 4 earnings reports, which obviously past results don't guarantee future success, but that is a good record. And similarly, with all the growth happening with other social networks like Snapchat, combined with Pinterest being an emerging social network, it really stands to say that Pinterest is likely to do very well in the long term. One thing about Pinterest is that it was actually the top app in the App Store in September. And this is competing with apps like TikTok, which is still a very vibrant app. And you have other apps that it's competing with that are very big name. So the fact that Pinterest was a top app and is getting more of a teen population, it shows that the social network has a lot of room to run. And a lot of the social networks that become successful, a teen population adopts them first, and then it gets adopted by the masses later on. Now, Pinterest, it's not this tiny social network. It's a big social network. In fact, even bigger than Twitter. So Pinterest already has a lot of monthly active users. And when we look at valuations, because it is good to look at valuations to make the determination, when Pinterest had this massive spike, it also had a big growth in its price to sales, which is currently sitting at 20, which is a little bit high. Snapchat's is at around the same point. Facebook is only at around 10, and Twitter hovers also at around 10 with the price to sales ratio. So Pinterest is priced a little high if you look at that ratio, although with earnings coming up, that ratio will have significant changes that go beyond the stock price, since we're getting more information pretty soon on how much Pinterest has grown. But the other thing to think about with Pinterest is one of the big mistakes people make when viewing Pinterest stock is they see it as a social network only. Pinterest is a mix of a social media play and an e-commerce play. So while you have Pinterest advertising, much like any other social network, there's also the e-commerce element. People like to browse on Pinterest and look for different things to buy. And you've got people on Pinterest who they buy more stuff on Pinterest than any other social network. Like Pinterest is the place that shoppers go, not as, big name as Amazon. Like when people think about shopping online, they naturally gravitate towards Amazon, but there are other options as well. Like people look to Shopify, although that's more of the businesses creating their own setups. People look to Etsy for handmade stuff and some more unique designs, but people also look to Pinterest for product recommendations. And it's a very different setup compared to other social networks. Another important thing about Pinterest is that they don't have any political cloud hanging over them. So Facebook is got the antitrust that they have to deal with, and Twitter also has a political cloud over them. Pinterest doesn't really have that. And since these big companies, Facebook, we're also throwing in Google, and they have the antitrust on them. So people are looking at them suspiciously. If they try to create a copy of Pinterest, then that is going to not look so good for the antitrust case. So Pinterest kind of has some free room to run. And Facebook and Google, they both have tried and failed to copy Pinterest's model, similar to how we're now seeing Instagram Reels, which is a spin-off. I don't know if spin-off's the right word here, but it's pretty much the same exact thing that TikTok does. But they've tried that with Pinterest and they have not been successful. Pinterest has a unique model that is specifically working for them. So the business, the overall structure of Pinterest is great and has a lot of growth ahead. And you combine that with how well Snapchat did, and it does look a little pricey at price of sales of 20, but with Pinterest continuing to grow revenues, that number, price to sales ratio, it will look more attractive as the growth continues. Now, what I think could possibly happen is maybe before earnings, there is a temporary, very short-term drop just because Pinterest stock literally went up practically 9%, even though this is more based on Snapchat's success rather than Pinterest's success. So Pinterest went up in anticipation of a blowout earnings season. This could kind of take some of the wind out of the earnings season, because what happens with some stocks is they have this massive rise up to earnings and they report good earnings, but the rise up was already baked in. Pinterest is a stock that I would recommend holding on to for years. I wouldn't do an earnings trade on this in the sense where you get in and you get out. Pinterest is one of those stocks that you will definitely want to hold on to in the long term. It has a lot of potential, not just as a social media stock, and it has a lower market cap than versus Twitter and Snapchat, which I think Pinterest could definitely surpass those two. And it definitely has a much lower market cap than Facebook, but Facebook is the top dog, and as well as Google, but Google's more of the search engine. YouTube's still a very big part of that company, obviously. But Pinterest has a lot of room to run as a social network and also the e-commerce element. So it's definitely more of a long-term approach for Pinterest. One of the ways you can approach is, instead of buying 100 shares, you could buy a call instead. But I do see and exercise the call because I do believe you want to hold on to this stock and it's going to be a big winner over the long term. And let me know what you guys think in the comments about Pinterest. I do feel like it is a compelling opportunity, a little bit of a high price to sales ratio, but then you look at stocks like Shopify that are over 60 price to sales, and there's just so much growth opportunity, and that's part of why these stocks get extremely high valuations. And I feel like we've all, or at least a lot of us, have had this scenario where here a stock is overvalued, but it just keeps on going up because there's so much potential within that stock. So again, let me know what you guys think in the comments about Pinterest, and I'll see you guys in the next one.